1. Personal narrative, language, neocontext. Signed, Razor. Found, cell number 7, Targite City Prison. Dated 3101, third span. When people ask me about Keen Draden, I always lie. The truth is, I never really knew Keen. He wasn't the kind of person who let you in. There was always a wall. You knew he was pushing against it, trying desperately to break through. In the end, it crumbled around him and bared his soul. And yet, that still doesn't tell you anything about him. I was angry when we first met. Part of it was a youthful stampede, galloping over anything in my way. But it was also the result of an oppressive world. I was molded from the struggle of hard rock, dry sand, and grit. The desert wind blew through my blood. From an expanse of dunes, I learned to speak arid words. We were all that way, those of us raised on Call 2 and not lucky enough to live in the Fens. Out in the sands, life wasn't about tariffs, trade, and ecotech competition. It was about scrapping and surviving. We, however, had something that no one could take away, a reason to endure. Our culture, our land, our subsistence had been stolen from us, and because of that, we sought revenge. The bullseye of my vengeance was Keen Draden. It's a complicated and costly endeavor, seeking retribution. When I think back on those who didn't make it through our struggle, I'm reminded of the way the credits roll at the end of a beautiful tragedy. The nostalgic music makes it all seem worth it, as if everything was meant to happen. That every life lost was given so that the way things ended made up for it. Maybe that was the case on Call 2. But the tide of tragedy wanes. Pity grows tired. Those of us who survived convince ourselves that justice is the expected consequence of sacrifice, that loss is what it takes to receive something worth all the suffering and grief. I don't like to remember Keen that way, and I know he wouldn't like others to either. As I said, it's complicated. Keen would have preferred to leave it before the finale, when the threads of our lives and those we fought were still tangled in a bald mess. Maybe that's the best way to describe Keen. His life was in perpetual stasis, mired in the third act. He'd tell you it was bogged down in the middle of Act 2, but that would be another lie. The third act, just before the end. His wall had crumbled, but that gave him the strength to finally accept himself and do what was right, even if it was too late to turn the tide. Keen is gone, and I endure. My cold plate of revenge served long ago. This is my story, and therefore his as well, remembered by the one who despised him, resented him, and sought to destroy him. And I did. I'll never forgive myself, though I desperately want to. That would be enough for Keen. 2. Keen Draden wasn't one for welcoming parties. The feigned hospitality and diplomatic bootlicking did nothing for his overinflated ego. His self-importance was already spilling over the rim onto his exterior. It showed in his ostentatious attire and the casual arrogance with which he chose his words. At this point in his career, a welcoming party only delayed the road to more important, and not coincidentally self-indulgent, occupational rewards. Skip the formalities and get straight to business. That had been his motto for over 2 decades. The irony of the personal credo wasn't lost on him. The part of the job he hated was the job. He was a Notos ambassador, charged with negotiating energy trade between star systems. There was no avoiding the endless parade of gestural formalities, greeting lines, and obsequious groveling at every stop throughout the Sagittarius Arm. Today would be no exception. The planetary delegation on Call 2 were extraordinary hosts. Despite their vicious business acumen and strained relations with other colonies, the lone inhabitants of the Alluring system had a knack for diplomatic flattery. Isolated by over 40 light-years from their nearest neighbors, they were apt to be gracious with guests, especially an official visit from a member of the Arm Council. Whether Keen liked it or not, he was heading for an overblown, ceremonious arrival. "Brace for atmospheric reorientation, Ambassador," a voice announced over the intercom. Keen picked up on the subtle sing-song speech unique to Call 2's inhabitants. So, the shuttle pilot bringing him out of orbit was local. That was good. It meant familiarity with the planet's turbulent flying conditions. The pilot's role of the R's on Ambassador in Neo-Context, the official language of the Sagittarius Arm, lingered in a way unfamiliar to his ears. He'd only heard the formal dictation of delegates who'd made the trip to speak at council headquarters on Saren. The diplomats who represented Call 2 and Garset, Saren's capital, and the political nexus of the interstellar Garasian Empire, spoke with less inflection. Perhaps it was a dialect, or reflected a less official, vernacular mode of speech. He tightened the chest straps against his portly belly. A crease appeared on his ambassadorial robe where the belts rested. Ring-laden fingers gripped the white fabric, pulling it taut in an attempt to erase the fold. It refused to settle. "For the sake of—" Keen huffed and gave up, releasing his grip. The wrinkle wasn't worth his time. These backwater zealots were too crude a culture to notice or care. The whole visit was nothing more than a time-consuming performance to please the council and, once again, allow a failed diplomatic effort to serve as evidence to justify all-out war. He pressed the refill button on the armrest, watching as chilled quicksilver bubbled into the cocktail tube from the interior beverage system. "There was a time when my trips mattered." Keen slammed back the elixir and glanced out the portal as the transfer pod banked into Call 2's rushing winds. The shuttle's internal stabilizers absorbed the brunt of the turbulence. Little more than a mild vibration ran through his corpulent body in the fluid-shelled passenger seat. He'd been expecting worse. Carpety Technologies finally making a name for itself. About time, considering the investments we've made. A few miles distant, the wind-shielded landing tarmac on the edge of Targite, Call 2's capital city, edged into view. Straight ahead to the horizon was nothing but blue-gray, arid, and barren wasteland. Call 2's cloudless, rose-hued atmosphere met the rolling dunes in a rich color juxtaposition like an evaporated sea at permanent sunset. The shuttle completed its turn and 5 long, sleek buildings intruded on the emptiness out the portal. Their geometrically precise forms ran along the planet's sands like stealthy aquatic creatures breaking an ocean's surface. Inside each, a hidden cornucopia of biodiversity and affluent human culture countered the harsh outside realities of the isolated planet. Soothed by the quicksilver, Keen's attention shifted from Call 2's uncouth exterior to thoughts of upcoming delights at Targite's sheltered oasis. He edged up in his seat, eyes following the slender, mirrored structures as they ran into the distance. The legendary fins. Miles back at their terminuses, colossal circular capture tubes curved upward and forward to face the barrage of raging air during the wind tides, channeling the wayward currents to power the city. Even though Targite was considered a rival energy manufacturer, he couldn't help but admire their innovative and pioneering enviro-synchronization. without Targitian ingenuity in the early years before the Patent War, eco-technology would still be centuries behind its current innovations. There would be no third revival, no Hammett alliance, no resurrection from the ashes of the last galactic civilization in the Sag Arm, and no consulate to give him employ. The vibration ceased as the pod completed its arc into the headwind. Mild turbulence gave way to a subtle sensation of deceleration as the craft fought against the tenacious jet stream. Out of the portal, beyond Targite's 5 blade-like city ridges, lay nothing save empty ripples of blue-gray dunes. Call 2's waterless ocean. Let's hope you don't ruin my visit. Keen knew accepting the Targitian invitation of an on-site inspection of turbine capacitors was risky. It wasn't the harsh conditions or wind amidst the planet's vast and largely uninhabited landscape that worried him. It was the Motes. Council security assured him the Targitians had driven the rogue nomads back into the rock hills enough times that their raids were now few and far between. Their weapon technology was nothing more than a mashup of flotsam and jetsam from their scavenger lifestyle, and no match for the sophistication of Sag Arm defense systems. Between their crude arsenal and hit-and-run tactics, the Motes were nothing more than anachronistic sand pirates. Specks of dust refusing to give in to the inevitable. They'll sober into the world or die fighting against it. Keen didn't care either way. The time of resistance to ecotech monopolies ended over 2 decades ago. His resistance, along with everyone else who'd fought in the Patent War, had passed as well. Like a rogue wave on a placid sea, that momentary revolutionary fervor rolled out to crash on some other's distant shore. But it hadn't swept everything away. Like barnacles clinging to submerged timbers, decisions hold fast for decades. By now, in 3049, the tide of war had ebbed long enough for fate to resurface. Keen's hand went to the milky green medallion on his chest, circling its metallic trim. The fallout of his choice lay hidden inside the jewel's interior chamber. "Would you like a head shielder, Ambassador?" Stow, Keen's AI assistant, appeared in the aisle, holding a transparent circular capsule. The bipedal droid blinked and smiled with its usual over-polite deference. Keen did his best to restrain his annoyance. The AI's demeanor was a hint of the social game to come. "No, Stow. I've got eye dusters." He held up the 2 pressure suction lenses, peering through the parallel slits at the humanoid's face. "Plus, I want to get a taste of Call 2's wind." "Why? I've no idea. Lost youth arising through stubborn waters, perhaps?" Keen gazed out the portal. A trail of dust caught his eye, far off to the north. A smile pushed his heavy cheeks upward. To be back in my youthful glory, a taloncaster in my hand, and nothing but a drink waiting at the end of each day, before it all went wrong. "That's a wind cutter, Ambassador," Stow said, leaning down and peering out the portal. Keen grunted. He was looking forward to stillness, not speed on their arrival. He'd been in hyperspace for a week, and on this pod for almost 2 hours. He expected the upcoming landing to be the roughest part of the flight. His back hurt, and though he knew he should move around more, all he wanted was to move less. Keen hit the refill for more quicksilver and ran a hand through his long, brown, curly locks. With dramatic flair, he repositioned the 2 cascading manes onto his chest, so they lay equally between his ambassadorial medallion. The pendant, worn by all Notos diplomats, echoed the green hue of his eyes. His thumb and index finger, a deep olive, arced over his elegant mustache before gliding down his black and gray goatee, fingering the ruby pendant tied at its base. These backwater wind-eaters better have a decent sense chamber and suite, and an impressive stock of ferments, considering the amount of tariff blood they've squeezed out of half the Sag Arm. The diplomatic visit to Targite, originally on his schedule for council politics, was now a professional layover en route to a more important and personal destination, one he dreaded but needed to reach, at least since his conscience made an appearance and broke up the party. Keen had wrangled that beast before. He knew how to break through its guard and send it reeling back into the bottomless depth whence it came. It wasn't last call yet. If he did his job today, he'd be fine. Get out to a turbine field, look around on site, and make enough of a show pushing to inspect the internal mechanisms, which he and the council knew the Targitians would refuse, and return to their capital. One obligatory evening inside the city, making his way through the diplomatic niceties of a dinner reception, and then on to the Nushaba system. He'd wrap up his private matter and be back on the cruiser for the long ride home to Siren and the comforts of his residence in the Grassian capital, guilt-free and ready to resume the party. The council would have what it needed to wage war. Keen didn't agree, but he didn't care. This was his last run. He'd retire rich, very rich. Keen knocked back the quicksilver and returned to view out the portal. The wind cutter in the distance tacked left to ride the wind's edge, zigzagging its way to the horizon. Speed is approximately 162 miles per hour, Stow said. If it stays on its present course, it will reach the closest turbine field in half a day's travel time. We're not going on one of those, are we, Stow? No, Ambassador. Council security demanded that the Targitians take you in a dust carrier transport with 4 wind cutter escorts. Good. You're coming too, I hope. Keen stroked his goatee, still gazing out the portal. The transport will remind them of my importance. If you like, Ambassador. I know that. The wind cutter tacked right, its trail of dust mushrooming as it came about in the wind. Keen's eyes squinted as he picked up movement at the horizon. He leaned closer to the portal. A series of black dots spread into view, moving towards the wind cutter. They looked like mites. Stow hadn't finished his sentence. You know what? Keen asked. He squinted to focus on the distant specks on the horizon. Stow didn't respond. Not mites. Stow, are those? Motes, a voice said. It was the same quirky accent he'd heard earlier over the comm. Keen turned. The AI droid was down on its knees, the hair of its head gripped in the hand of a tall person with spiky, red hair. Onyx skin and the telltale green and yellow Targite pilot uniform left no doubt that they were from Call, too. Keen looked at Stow. The droid's face held a lifeless stare that indicated deactivation. The pilot raised the other hand, and Keen found himself staring down the barrel of a blaster. Red dune marks on obsidian knuckles stretched as they tightened their grip. His stomach dropped. Mote. Actually, Ambassador, the pilot said, giving him a mocking smile, you won't be going on that dust carrier. Ice blue eyes shot to the empty cocktail tube. Good, you've had some quicksilver. Their hand released Stow, who crumbled to the floor. They pressed the button, refilling his drink, keeping the blaster aimed at him. Have another, the pilot said. You'll need it. So, is this going to be abduction and ransom, or are you intending to trade me? Keen pushed his pawn forward on the board. Despite the blaster muzzle pressed against his temple while the mote locked him into the seat with wrist and ankle bracelets, he wanted the first rhetorical move. The pilot eyed him and fastened the second ankle to the carpety seat unit. It was feigned annoyance, well performed, but still not good enough to be convincing. "Who's flying, by the way?" The mote ignored him, rose, and stepped back into the aisle. "Here it comes, here's the deal and what you are and aren't going to do." "Okay, Ambassador, here's the deal." Keen chuckled at his rhetorical foresight. His ears caught the same unfamiliar pronunciation of ambassador that he heard earlier. Now he knew why. It was a regional dialect, context spoken with a mote accent. "Are you paying attention?" the mote asked. He looked out the portal. "Hey!" They grabbed his curly locks and tugged him in their direction. "Ouch!" He glared at them. "Mind the hair. Listen up, Ambassador. We're going to lay this pod down behind that line of dust carriers." A firm hand pivoted his head back towards the portal. More specks emerged over the horizon. The earlier ones at the head of the regiment had overtaken the wind cutter. Whatever or whoever was heading towards the turbine field was either dead or in a predicament similar to his own. The specks raced over the dunes in a triangular pattern, employing standard battalion formation. That meant that someone out there, or back at the Mote home base, had served in the Patent War and was familiar with open planet engagement. "Once we're down, you're going to get on the comm and contact Targite Lead Council." Why, exactly? Keen glanced at the cocktail tube, wishing he could down more quicksilver to steel his nerves. His finger glided in a gentle circle over the fill button. He could push it, but he couldn't drink in the braces unless he asked for help. Better not to. It would bolster his weakness in the predicament. And if the mote refused, he'd be eyeing chilled quicksilver with a watering mouth. Not his idea of a good time. Worse would be a hot landing with it spilling all over his white robe. No, this would be a semi-sober negotiation with amateur rebels. His gall would grow from frustration. So far, Keen wasn't impressed. He'd been in their shoes. You needed to load the deck and make sure you held an unbeatable hand to take on a larger, more formidable opponent like the Targitians. The Motes were about to learn a hard truth. "We're cashing in on your diplomatic value," the imposter pilot said. "Oh, yes? For what in return?" "You'll know when I tell you." The Mote released his head, rough enough so humiliation and domination were intrinsic in the gesture, and walked back to the cockpit. "And it's piloté. You'd think a diplomat would have asked by now." Keen had been so caught up in the dangerous situation that he neglected to address the Mote. Even in a hostage situation, considering his profession, his neglect bordered on egregious disrespect. It might even come back to bite him later on. As the pilot, she'd gained access to his chosen self-expression via the pod's flight log when she infiltrated the crew. Normally, individuals declared their gender to one another at first meeting through culturally ubiquitous suffixes attached to their spoken names, through hand signing, or in a service industry via a visible icon on a uniform. If someone's gender identity shifted between social interactions, the process was repeated so they would be addressed and received appropriately. Otherwise, once declared, the suffix, hand sign, or icon wasn't reintroduced unless forgotten, or if somebody accidentally, or intentionally, as did happen in cases of insult, misgendered an individual. If that happened, or if substantial time passed between social encounters, it was reintroduced as a courtesy to ensure respectful and appropriate discourse. Keen knew that the present situation was unorthodox. There was no social precedent, and the Mote wasn't likely to offer her name in case he got away. As a Notos ambassador whose occupation centered on formal language and cultural etiquette, and with the conversation getting rigorous, the Mote was right. Social responsibility fell on him to ask. So much for the first rhetorical move. The Mote raised her chin and glared at him with ice-blue eyes before turning to enter the cockpit. Something about the way she gestured read as performative. That and the physical bullying. The excessiveness told Keen that this wasn't their usual tactic. It was forced and contrived. The Mote's big move against Targite was part bluff, with too much hope resting on a large return for the high-risk play. He decided to risk pushing back to make up lost ground. "You've got one more problem, Mote," Keen said. She turned halfway through the cockpit door. He eyed her with performative drama, pushing back. Outwardly, he exuded arrogance and defiance, but internally, he operated with diplomatic engines running full steam. There it was, a flicker of hesitation on her face. It kindled a fire of doubt to his eyes, as hot as the spiky hair rising from her head. The Motes didn't spend much time gambling out in the blue dunes. "You're not holding any cards," he said. "You mean because you're more interested in your second stop in the Nushaba system?" Keen's confidence left him, and his eyes went wide. The Mote smiled and slipped the blaster into her thigh holster. She reached into a pocket of her flight suit and pulled out a gold bounty cube, a smug expression on her face. "So, I'm for sale." "Well played," he said, buying time. He'd been sold out to a bunch of pathetic rebels? Keen had been through a buyback once in the past when he was in his diplomatic prime. That time, he'd almost been exposed in a corrupt side deal that would have jeopardized his job. It cost him more to retrieve the cube than the profit of the entire ruse. But now, he never expected it a second time so late in his career. "You want the cube? Get all our prisoners in Targite released." "Easy," Keen waved a hand. Was that it? Pathetic. "And we get 2 seats on the council." "In Garrison? Mote representation is a part of the Call 2 delegation?" She nodded. "Sitting next to the Targitians. Full veto power for anything planet-based." Keen laughed and shook his head. "You'll never get it. They won't take that deal. I'm not worth it, Mote. Plus, you aren't even in the energy business." "Then they get the cube, Ambassador. And war, at the fault of diplomatic corruption. I'm sure the Targitians know how to exploit evidence of the clandestine funding you plan on streaming to Heroon, a traitor to your government, supporting anti-monopoly rebels to keep Garrison from squashing a threat to their control of a territorial planet. And Heroon, no less, the core of the rotten apple for the entire history of corruption and abuse of power in the third span. Seems like an easy way to rally half the Seg Arm against Garrison. Not to mention a charge of high treason. You'll be executed under orders from your own fellow council members, including your parent, if I'm not mistaken." The Motes got it wrong. This isn't political. Under the circumstances, Keen couldn't deny it. If he did, he'd be outing a personal scandal far worse and with greater reach and job-related ramifications. He should have known better than to trust his private information to an inter-system banker with ties to the underworld. The only option now was to play the game and negotiate his way to a feasible political offer that would get him out of this mess. "So, I get the Targitians to open their confinement cells," Keen countered, "and release your rebel kin. How about I set up an exploratory committee to consider reviewing Call 2 representation on the council?" "No deal. We trade you back and you leave with no way to follow up." "Would you accept an agreement through a third party?" "On the council?" The Mote knew her diplomatic law book. He'd give her that. "Best scenario, yes, a non-Targitian supplied star system. If not, I get you an invitation and safe passage to plead your case in person." She fingered the gold cube. Keen watched her long, onyx fingers roll the small data box around in her hand. Red dune marks swirled like ripples across still water. And I get that. Keen eyed the bounty cube since he couldn't point a finger, which buys me enough time to get to Heroon. After that, let them come for me. The mote put the small square back in her pocket and opened the cockpit door. Not good enough. We'll take our chances on the value of your treachery instead. She walked through and closed the door. The pod bucked as the autopilot disengaged. Keen's hold over the situation collapsed. This day is getting better and better. It didn't make sense. No one is this desperate. The pod dove at a hard angle. Styles' lifeless body shot up to the ceiling. Keen clenched the armrests and gritted his teeth. Quicksilver rose into his throat. What's she doing? The pod shook and rattled, cutting a diagonal path through the raging winds. The Carpetti gel capsule was way past its absorption range. Keen's stomach swirled like rough sea against the rocky shoreline. The quicksilver belched up into his mouth, burning his esophagus. "A Hammet's ass! What are you doing?" he yelled. The craft cut across a lesser current, responding to the shift in air temperature by surging upward. Stow slammed to the floor. The quicksilver came back up for an encore. Blah! Keen spewed opaque gray liquor and chunky bits of his breakfast all over his white robe. He retched after the initial hurl, dry heaving and drooling saliva onto his ambassadorial medallion. Arrgh! He pulled and kicked at the wrist braces and ankle locks. Fucking Carpetti technology! The pod leveled off. He worked to find his center, gazing at the blue horizon line out the portal. They dove again, banking the other way. Keen's head whipped around. Stow flew up and across the neighboring seats. The droid stared at him, plastered against the wall, eyes open, yet lifeless. Keen spat post-vomit mouth juice and sneered at the mess that was now his outfit. Perfect, he laughed, dribbling a long strand of saliva. What do you think, Stow? He asked, acquiescing to his state of helplessness and humiliation. Will the Targitians take my robe for the latest trends in Garrison? The pod shot upward. Stow collapsed into the seats across the aisle. Hey, Mote! Keen barked at the cockpit door, fighting the G's. Check out my new look. It's the latest fashion. The pod swirled in a double roll and banked hard right, cutting off his sarcastic banter. A green flash through the portal illuminated the interior as a stream of laser bolts passed to port. What the? The pod nosedived. Why would the Motes be firing? The craft leveled off and the cockpit door flew open. What's going on? He demanded. The Mote hurried over and unlatched him. Something's wrong. I need you in the cockpit. What? She heaved him up and shoved him towards the door. Who's shooting at us? The Mote pushed him down into the co-pilot seat. Here, she withdrew his safety buckle for him and got back into the pilot's chair. Keen pulled the belt over his vomit-drenched robe. It squished as he tightened it fast. For the sake of the arm. The Mote hit the thrusters as another burst of green lasers sprang up from the defense lines on the edge of Targite's city boundary. That's Targite fire. Keen leaned forward over the dashboard to view the ground attack. She banked down and left to avoid it. He tracked back towards the horizon. A full-on battle raged on the planet's surface between the Mote forces and the defense lines of the city. We're almost locked on the air targeting system, a male voice, similar in accent to the pilot's, but filled with urgency, reported over the comm. Get past our line. On it, she responded, and maneuvered against another barrage. Keen watched the Mote work the virtual grid. She was a cool customer, a damn good pilot in the chaos. For that, he was thankful. She leaned over him, reaching for a set of controls, and winced as her arm smeared the vomit on his chest. You encouraged me to drink more, he said in his defense. A single stick with finger grips popped up on the dashboard in front of him. I need you on this. She nodded at the handle and pulled out a set of glasses from an overhead compartment. Put these on. Use the internal crosshairs. Look and lock with the trigger. The system will stay tracked. Hit the thumb button and it'll fire. Got it? You want me to fire on the Targitians? You want to live? She said, working the pod's controls to maneuver in the heavy winds while dodging enemy laser shots. Don't care that much either way, Mote. Keen folded his arms on his chest and immediately regretted it. Vomit seeped into his sleeves. It took all his diplomatic skills to keep his expression obstinate. The Mote glanced over. He shot her a defiant look. Winning this one was no contest. She was struggling with the controls, losing her concentration in the firefight. You know what I want, he said. Her nostrils flared. She tightened her grip on the yoke, slamming the pod to port. Keen's arms went wide, gripping the dashboard instinctually. He quickly refolded them. She reached in her pocket and slammed the gold cube into his stomach, splattering bits of vomit all over the dashboard. Typical politician. Keen took the cube and dropped it into a slit in his robe. Good enough, Ambassador. That'll do. Thank you. Laser fire whizzed past the pod. Keen peered through the eye guidance lenses. Another set of fighters launched from the shielded landing tarmac at the north end of the city. He locked on one and fired, taking it out before the craft rose more than a few hundred feet off the ground. Not bad, she said, sending them into an evasive roll and pitch, working a path towards the safety of the Mote defenses. Not my first shitstorm, Mote. She glared at him. Keen interpreted as equal parts contempt and surprise. I don't get this. They should be trying to protect me, he said, while struggling to take out another fighter. The remaining Targitian attack pods rose out of their low-altitude launch zone and fired their thrusters up to full. Now they'd be more crafty and evasive. Don't care that much either way, Ambassador, she said. Who? You? The Targitians. It only took them about a minute to decide after I sent them the hostage demands. She was right. How easily the life of an ambassador is cast aside for the greater politic shouldn't have surprised him. Keen locked on another fighter and took out its wing, sending it hurtling towards the surface of Call 2. Seems they took this as an opportunity to get rid of two enemies, she said. I'm not the enemy. I'm an ambassador. They're business rivals. That was stretching the truth, but that's what he did for a living. It came naturally, even under pressure. So, the Targitians intended to make him a casualty of a Mote ambush. It was a clever ruse, a council ambassador taken out by anti-monopoly rebels, in the bloodline of the High Council chair, no less. That would put a serious dent in the council's war agenda and give the Targitians the excuse needed to get past the diasporic clause. At minimum, it would delay any political action by the garrison council and give the Targitians the ability to take care of their Mote problem once and for all. And where did this leave him? A large explosion at the edge of the city raised a blazing smoke plume. Air defense is out, the voice from earlier yelled over the comm. Should have a lane if we can hold off those fighters. Get back here. This thing is blown. They're sending counters. We have to. The Mote speaking from the ground assault never got to finish the sentence. 5 streams of orange flame ripped through the Mote line of dust carriers like a massive beast swiping a claw across flesh. It devastated the arrow formation of the rebel force. The Mote's blue eyes went wide in horror. Hody! Her face erupted in desperation. No! Green lasers passed close to the cockpit window. To starboard! Watch out! Keen lunged for the controls. The back half of the pod whiplashed as the laser struck. He slammed against the side of the seat. Warning lights flashed and alarms sounded. The Mote snapped back and worked the controls. The pod bucked and started losing power. We're hit. I have to get us below the wind tide or... Or what? We'll tear apart. She struggled with what was left of the pod's flight system. Electrical smoke wafted into the cockpit. Keen watched the altimeter run down. The pod jounced and let out a mechanical belch. All the dashboard lights flickered, then went out. An eerie quiet intruded the cockpit. "No power," she said, her voice stuttering against the turbulence of the wind tide's current. "Switching to flaps." The mote reached down and pulled out the foot pedals and tucked her feet inside the toe slips. She wiped the sweat dripping from her forehead and gripped the hand controls. "We're screwed, aren't we?" Keen asked. "Been screwed my whole life. This is only new to you." Her icy eyes shone with cold fire. They burned cooler than when she'd first restrained him, yet were more intense with anger. Or was it fear? Keen opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. That was a first. He took off the glasses, hands rattling from the jet stream, and watched as they passed the 5 blazing fire lines where the moat ambush had been demolished. Ahead was nothing but blue sand. "I'm going to ride the bottom edge of the current as long as I can to give us some distance," she said. "In case we make it." "Make it where?" "The dunes." Keen's eyes went to the moat's hands wrapped around the pod's controls, the red dune mark letters on her onyx knuckles. The telltale signature of the motes took on a potent mystery. "What do they say?" "Huh?" The mote's head didn't turn. "The dune marks on your hands." "Fuck off," she said, jerking her legs back and forth, working to stabilize the injured craft. Keen counted the letters in his head. It fit, but that would be too ironic. "No, seriously, what did they say?" The turbulence halted. "We're under the wind current," she said. "That's as far as I could get us." Keen scanned the dune landscape in all directions. "How long to the nearest turbine field?" "You're on your own if we make it." "What about holding me ransom?" "You're worthless now, Ambassador." A smirk edged onto her face, like a card player playing an unbeatable hand down on a gambling table in front of a large pot. "Welcome to my world." She was right. They were screwed. He had to admire her honesty in the face of it. It was more than he could muster, and that stung. Even if they did survive the crash, where would that leave him? The Targitians would send a crew out, but after what went down, wouldn't they kill him? Maybe he'd make it and she wouldn't. He might be able to bargain with the Targitians. If the moat was badly injured, he could finish the job before then. What did he owe her? He was in this situation because of what she did. Heck, she deserved it. It had been over 25 years since he'd killed someone. Could he still do it? And what do those dune marks say? "We're going down. Hold on," she said. The blue sands neared. Alteron's orb of white light shone in the rose-tinted sky. Keen's robe was a hot mess. How perfect. This was exactly the way he should be at the end. "Brace for impact," she said. The words seeped into his ears like honey rolling from a jar. Time slowed and stretched, his mind graciously opening space for a final mortal reflection. So, this was it. His hand went to the medallion on his chest, clasping it with regret. Out of the cockpit window, a high dune ridge loomed. "Rise, Cole 2," the mote whispered.